Alison, hey, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thank you.
It's really good to have you here. We're starting our videos by asking contributors to introduce themselves and give us an overview of their work. So would you mind doing that, please?
Sure, I'm Alison Waller and I'm reader in children's literature at the University of Roehampton in London. I work on two different areas, really. One is young adult fiction and ideas about adolescence. And the other area is about reading and particularly around memories of childhood reading. So I'm very interested in how older people recall the books from their youth and what happens when they try and do that with any kind of accuracy. So those are the two areas I work in. I'm also quite interested, as we all have to be now, in online learning and working with students who are learning remotely, because I've worked for a long time with the MA in Children's Literature by Distance Learning at Roehampton. So I'm intrigued by the new challenges and opportunities that the pandemic has brought.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know if it's possible to kind of link those last two things, but that notion of kind of memory, older memories of younger reading, and then distance learning. There's something there about communication and communication across forms of separation. That might be a really naff way of linking those two things, but
I think
it's
that's
quite interesting.
interesting. Yeah, well, there's something to be said about the synchronicity that we all hope for when we're teaching, I suppose, that is actually a bit of a fallacy, or at least it can actually work in different ways than we might expect. So I'm thinking about the ways that we might want to be in a classroom with real live breathing people moving and thinking in front of us, but actually the way we're talking right now will appear live to people who are watching the video. And I suppose the same happens when we read. Certainly as scholars of literature, we're used to thinking about the words on the page and the text in front of us being a static thing, but actually coming alive in our imaginations and feeling very present as we encounter those words one by one. So I think there is something there about synchronicity that that is less straightforward than we normally think. And maybe the ideas of teaching online have opened up sort of new avenues of recognizing that we're always alive, we're always in conversation with each other, whether that's in a physical space or whether it's online or whether it's across the generations or whether it's between ourselves now and ourselves when we were much younger. There's still a kind of live conversation happening.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. I had my own experience of this under lockdown. I reread the book I remember most vividly falling in love with as a child, which is Penelope Lively's The Ghost of Thomas Kemp.
Oh, I know
And I
that.
have the most profoundly visceral memories of being read that book at school. And I don't really know how old I was, but probably 7, 8, 9. And I could tell you so much about what the environment of being read that book was like and falling in love with that book. And I reread it under lockdown conditions, and I didn't come across a single passage that triggered a single memory. So I don't know if that resonates with anything that you discovered in your work, but yeah, all of my memories, which are incredibly vivid, have nothing to do with text, nothing to do with story, nothing to do with character. Yeah, do you mind telling us a bit about that work, thinking about memories of childhood reading?
Sure. I mean, that certainly was a key finding, that many adults thought they would recall a book very clearly, had very strong emotional connections with the text, and felt very passionate about it. But like you, when pushed to actually come up with content or to think about what it was about the book that they loved so much or recalled, really struggled. So part of my work in the book I published last year was this sort of experimental approach to memories and reading, where I asked a number of adults to recall books from their childhood. It didn't have to be books that they loved. It might have been books that were significant in some other way. So I was trying to push for alternative kind of emotional connections, possibly books that they hated or that terrified them, or perhaps they found boring. because I don't think we talk enough about boring books, and they are a huge part of anyone's reading journey. So I asked these adults to recall books and talk about them, remember as much as they could, in interview normally, or maybe in a written account. And then those who were willing, I asked to go and reread the book, to find a copy, or I could help them find a copy and reread it. So it was pretty much what you had done with Lively's book on Kemp. And yeah, most people found that they didn't recognise that much, or at least the recognition was partial and sometimes surprising. There were lots of accounts where readers had forgotten the quality of a certain text, and quite often it was a feeling of disappointment or even shame that these individuals encountered in themselves, either because they couldn't remember enough and they felt, I think, a bit embarrassed by that, or that they didn't recognise the emotional response of their childhood self, that what they had initially found so enticing or compelling no longer held that attention for them, and they found that slightly surprising. It's not the case for everybody. There were some people who still managed to kind of enter back into that childhood reading self and re-encounter the book in a sort of fresh and excited way. But most people, I would say, had a slightly distanced perspective on that childhood reading self, which I found really fascinating. And one of the reasons I started that work was the interest I have in academics, certainly literary scholars' approach to the books of their childhood. Working in children's literature, often you'll come across colleagues and peers who are working with books that they did love as children, and that's part of the reason why they go back to them. Of course, it's a good entry point for critical study. And I noticed in quite a lot of work, particularly feminist work perhaps, that there was this tendency towards kind of decrying the younger self, dismissing the views of an earlier reading and kind of rereading in order to correct what was seen as a naive perspective. And I've always found that really uncomfortable, particularly as a children's literature scholar, because the idea that children's reading is simply naive goes against everything we believe in terms of the value and the importance and the validity of a youthful reading experience. So I wanted to try and break that down a little bit. I could see it at work in most of the readers I did work with, but I wanted to make sure that there were alternative models for thinking about the childhood reading self that didn't have to be just, oh, I didn't know anything back then, or I was so ridiculously naive, or how could I be taken in by, C.S. Lewis's sexist approach to girls and boys in the Narnia series, which is a very common response. So yeah, part of the purpose of the book really was to set out a model of response through memory and rereading that allowed for a little bit more nuance and a bit more sort of subtlety in thinking about the adult and the child.
And you talked about the disappointment and shame that some of the people you were speaking to experienced, which in many ways works counter to the purpose of the book as you're describing it. I've understood it. So were there alternative models in the people that you spoke to?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as I say, not everybody felt that way or had that sort of judgmental approach to their earlier selves. There was a lot of discussion about the sort of value of rereading in terms of a generational heirloom, if you like, something that could be treasured again and passed on to children or quite often grandchildren, actually, and that shared experience of a text in what I call the sort of co-reading process, where you're both reading for the first time if you're a child, and then somebody else is co-reading with you for a repeated time. And yeah, often that was grandparents with grandchildren, sometimes grandparents who had attempted to share their favourite books with their own children and failed, but found a new audience with the next generation along. And I think the most successful book in those terms, certainly with the cohort I was working with, who were generally of a slightly older demographic, so most of my participants were over 60, it was the Winnie the Pooh books and work by A.A. Milne and some of his poetry as well. That seemed to work really well as an heirloom text that could be enjoyed at different levels by different ages, and that seemed to certainly transcend something of the kind of contemporary moment as well, and could still be enjoyed. I think because it's got a lot of linguistic play that could be understood by everyone reading at the same time. So there was certainly a certain amount of pleasure and celebration in sharing favourite books from the past. And then I guess the other sort of approach that isn't to do with shame or disappointment, but isn't also not purely to do with pleasure, was the curiosity that many readers had in returning, discovering what they had forgotten or what they'd misremembered. And probably my favourite part of the study was the chapter I wrote on the gaps and the silences and the misrememberings and the things that go wrong when you're rereading. The fact that you might not be able to get hold of the edition that you had as a child, that it might have different illustrations, it might be translated differently if it's a foreign text, or it might just be that you have forgotten whole chunks or misremembered them. So that was my favourite chapter, and there's some really sort of interesting mysteries that could be delved into, not always solved. And my favourite, which I've talked about in a number of fora, is a particular example where a reader could recall a book about a guide dog. She knew it was about a guide dog. She knew it was a sort of slightly scary story about a boy who suddenly went blind, and she remembered that affecting her quite a lot and making her feel scared that it could happen to her, that she might wake up one day not being able to see. So it obviously had quite an emotional effect on her, this book. But it took us ages to find the book, because that was all she remembered, really. The feelings of fear, the fact that there was a guide dog, and one scene where the guide dog rescued the boy from falling off a cliff. So she recalled that this moment of peril that the guide dog saved the boy from, and at that point they became sort of buddies and everything went okay. But we took ages finding this book, and the problem when you don't have the author or the title is, well, how do you search for a book? Thankfully there are wonderful communities of children's literature experts online who you can go to and say, I've got this vague idea about a book I read once in the 1970s. So we discovered the book, and my participant reread it, and there's no scene with a cliff top at all. There is a scene where the boy trips, but it's not really as perilous as she recalled. So it was a really interesting moment, because she started to, I suppose, sort of psychoanalyze herself. Why did she recall it being so dangerous? Why was it such a thrilling scene in her imagination? And we didn't really come up with any answers, but there's lots of speculation you can enter into. Is it because she was so emotionally attached to that book and it fed into her own fears about losing her eyesight that she sort of exaggerated the moment of peril? Is it because she'd seen lots of other films or read other stories where clifftop scenes actually do occur? There's lots of different explanations. So I found that chapter fascinating. It opened up lots of questions and didn't answer any of them.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. I'm hearing lots of this, but from the point of view of the world that I work from as well, and thinking about the weirdness of the theatre of Shakespeare's time, where we don't have access to any of the plays that are on stage. We have these weird kind of textual memories in the forms of texts, often published much later than the performance itself. And there's a brilliant scholar called M.J. Kidney who's worked on how all the things we think of as Shakespeare's text, for example, are basically just memories and mental artifacts of something which is lost, and what happens to that process.
Yeah, and it's the memory of the stuff that you can't actually remember, if that makes sense. The knowledge that there is something there, but you don't know what it is. Margaret Mackey, who works in children's literature, calls it the murk, which I love, this sort of subterraneous world of stuff that is there, but you can't quite retrieve.
Yeah, and you talked about,
I guess then plays into the early modern world, because so much is lost.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about co-reading. There's also a form of co-authorship happening in the mind of the person remembering, right? Without realizing it. recomposing, reconstituting the text in the process of remembering it. And it sounds like you two are rereading the people that you're speaking to. They're rereading their memories, and you're part of that conversation. Do you mind telling us a bit about how that works?
Well, I do worry that story I tell about the individual, the guide dog and the cliff top, maybe I need to go back to my original source material and just double check. Because I've told that story so many times, I feel I've probably embellished. And I know how memory works. It is reconstructive. You do add to it and you will remember the memory rather than the original event itself. And you'll use memory to serve your own purposes as well. So I'm kind of aware of all of the possible pitfalls. I think, yes, there is a risk of that with any work that you do, gathering people's stories and narratives about their own past. And I used those interviews very much as texts in their own right. So I wasn't doing, I didn't do a representational survey. I wasn't thinking so much about who those people were in terms of ethnic background or other sort of demographics. It was much more about the stories they had to tell about their reading selves. So I would think of them as literary texts, the interview transcripts. And that gave me license to interpret them in the way I do as a literary critic. Though I do feel responsible for the individuals and the fact that they are real people with their own sort of lives and control over their lives. In most cases, I could sort of go back to them and ask if it was the right story I was telling, but actually not in all cases. I said earlier that some of the people I spoke to were in the older brackets, and some were just, I did the research and then lost contact. Some died, these things happen. So the ethics of telling other people's stories to make a narrative of your own and to build a model and to make an argument is something I do think about quite a lot. And I'm doing quite a lot more work with real people, talking to real people and working with real readers. And yeah, the ethics is something I'm increasingly concerned with and aware of. One of the projects I did last year was with a day centre, which sadly is currently closed because of the pandemic. It was a local day centre that works with individuals with dementia, early stage dementia. And I did a really amazing few weeks work with two of the clients of this day centre, talking about their memories of reading, thinking about their lives, and trying to tell some new stories based on the fragments that they could recover. And I worked with a brilliant creative writer called Gemma Seltzer and a comics book artist called Wallace Eats. And together they created a sort of new artifact based on all of these little lines of narrative and fragments of stories that were then presented to the people that we worked with in the day centre. And that felt very meaningful, a very meaningful project actually, but also very fraught with the kinds of ethical questions around who owns those stories, how are they being told, especially when the people we were working with weren't in complete control themselves of that memory. There were certain gaps and silences and discomfort sometimes around the past as well. So yeah, it was a fascinating project, and I'd love to do a little bit more of that kind of work in the future.
Yeah, that sounds completely amazing. Thank you. If it's all right, I'd like to move on to your current project. Before I do that, though, I want to make sure I say for people listening that the book we've been talking about is called Rereading Childhood Books, A Poetics, out last year. If you're looking at this video on our website, abitlit.co, then there will be a further resources section underneath this video, and we will link to your book there. So if you're watching us on YouTube, head over to our website and you'll find a link to Alison's book. But Alison, is it okay to move on to, I know you're thinking at the moment about ways of being ordinary, which feel especially important at this very non-ordinary, stubbornly unordinary time. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, and the origins of this work come before COVID, so it's strangely sort of convenient timing to be thinking about it, but not that I would wish a global pandemic on anyone, but it fits nicely with my research interests and has made me think differently about ordinariness and what it is to be normal or ordinary. And those are two concepts that I contrast. Actually, I don't think they are the same thing, to be normal and to be ordinary. And I'm working with those ideas in terms of young adult fiction and what it is to be both adolescent and ordinary. And I think the idea came to me partly because I think a lot of work in young adult literature has circulated around the extraordinary, and I'm not guilty, but I have fallen into that myself in previous work where I've focused on books that are about protagonists with special powers or supernatural abilities or magical transformations. I'm really interested in those kinds of fantastical protagonists and worlds. But it struck me that that is just one way of thinking about adolescence, which has been quite dominant, the sense that, being a teenager, being in that in-between state between childhood and adulthood, has something liminal and therefore slightly paranormal and extraordinary about it. That's only one way of thinking about youth and teenage life. And an alternative way of thinking about it is the fact that it's embedded in the everyday and the ordinary as much as any other stage of life. And in fact, being young and living in the world in an ordinary sense is perhaps really crucial, because although the mundane and the ordinary are tropes that we as adults recognise and perhaps get bored of, they are still things that young people are learning about and learning how to be in those routine, ordinary, diurnal kind of contexts. So a lot of the discourses around the everyday are about, going to work, for example. Now, this is something completely novel and exciting to a young person, potentially. Going to work isn't actually part of the everyday until they reach a certain age. Or, the structures of a domestic life, making meals, making sure that bedtimes are maintained. These are, again, boundaries that young people are exploring. The first time you make a meal for your parents is something quite cool. It was for me. And deciding when you need to go to bed yourself, these are actually kind of thrilling moments. So there's this tension with the ordinariness that embeds young people in the world around them, but also opens up new ways of being. And I thought that was worth exploring. I was also really keen to focus on British young adult literature and think about what it is to be British and ordinary and young, which is obviously quite a complex set of ideas to put together, because being British can mean so many different things. And in particularly, I think in the period I'm looking at, 2000 to 2020, so much has happened to challenge our ideas of nationhood and to intersect with concepts of ethnicity and class in particular. So I felt it was really interesting and important to look at those things in tandem. And British young adult fiction has perhaps been slightly left behind in critical approaches. A lot of work's been done on American YA, and that's often seen as the sort of standard. And if the person on the street was to think about a young adult novel, they might immediately go to the American dystopia, for example, from the last few years. Something like The Hunger Games comes to mind for a lot of people. So again, I wanted to shift attention a little bit away from the American focus and think about what it is about British YA that is perhaps different, that represents the world in slightly different ways. So I've started some work looking at ordinary objects and everyday places and routines. And I was telling my family about this the other day, and they were absolutely gobsmacked that you could make research out of cups of tea and bus journeys in teenage fiction. I think my sister was quite, yeah, well, exactly, every day. And so pervasive and so British, but obviously not straightforwardly so. So I think cups of tea, when you start looking for them in British YA, absolutely everywhere. You can't go a page without seeing one. And although they are partly there to just describe the backdrop, to create a certain realism, to fill the gaps, what Roland Barthes calls the reality effect, to provide this sort of concrete sense that this is the world that we know and recognise. There's certainly that aspect to them. But I think they signify more than that too. Obviously, they have a lot of narrative function. They can provide a pause in the action when somebody needs to think. They can show that somebody's caring for somebody else. They can sometimes actually provide a sort of ironic tension between the drama that's happening in a teenage character's life and the sort of mundane world that they are having to face at home or in their sort of adult interactions. And there's lots of different ways that the tea and the teacups and the accompaniments to the tea feature in these books as well. So there are cases where the tea is in mugs and very comforting, but there's also cases where the tea is being presented, for example, to a police officer in one book where the protagonist has got into trouble, and the tea is clearly a social marker of respectability. And something to placate the police officer while this child is being sort of questioned. So there's lots to be done, I think, with tea, and I'm hoping to start to do that.
Is there also that thing of who's making the tea? And again, it's kind of rite of passage, like cooking dinner for your parents. And is it a drink which again establishes your place on a kind of passage between childhood and adulthood, kind of caffeinated? And having that rather than a soft drink or whatever juice or whatever the alternative might be culturally or in terms of age, what it says about the people participating in that. Well, we use the word ritual, don't we, about tea because we're weird.
Yeah, no, absolutely, all those things. I think coffee probably works in a slightly different way, but has the same connotations of something a little bit more sophisticated than squash or milk or the other drinks of childhood. And the ritual, again, it gets played out in the texts quite often. You get descriptions, quite detailed descriptions of the kettle going on and the tea bags going in and the biscuits coming out. So there are moments that are learned behaviours from the adult world, I think.
Yeah, but you're right. It's a pause and a step away from whatever else is going on in the fictional day. But it's also a moment of, it's not really an escape because it's an invitation of intimacy, an invitation of reflection and moving on from whatever narrative tensions are around the characters, I guess.
Yeah. And there's a lovely moment. Let's see if I can find the book.
Hey.
My wonderful shelves behind me. No, I've lost it now. And as ever, I can never quite remember the title of the book when I need to. But it's from the 70s, so it's actually outside of my period. It's called, bear with me, It's My Life, by John Rowe Townsend. And it's very much a kind of kitchen sink drama-esque novel, which was quite a popular form in the 70s and 80s. Teenage fiction has often been described as going through a period of the problem novel or the issue novel, very sort of bleak realism, focusing on adolescent delinquency or teenage pregnancy or these sorts of social issues that were of a major concern around that period. And some of the fictional style, I think, reflects that bleakness in terms of the sociological anxieties around adolescence. So you get what can feel like quite drawn out dramas, but they have humorous touches to them. And I love It's My Life because it features tea all the way through, but it's so monotonous and so dull. But it's also often tea that never gets drunk. It gets made, somebody's clattering around the kitchen because they're having a huge argument. The protagonist has a huge argument with her father, and the tea gets made, but it doesn't get drunk, or it gets smashed in the sink, in a literal kind of kitchen sink moment. So yes, it can be a moment of intimacy, making tea for another person, but it can also show the fractures in that relationship when the tea is rejected or thrown across the room.
That's fascinating. Alison, I know you wanted to talk about the new journal, the International Journal of Young Adult Literature. Before we move on to that, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about the Ordinary project?
I think that's probably it for now. I mean, I've talked a lot about objects there, about the tea. I've also been thinking about bus journeys, as I say, and those kinds of modes of transport that are less than glamorous. You know, it's not the American road trip or the buddy movie, it's the trip on the double-decker bus. So I'm interested in objects and modes of transport, but also ways of being. And so the next chapter I'm going to be moving on to and thinking about deals with ordinary bodies, and particularly those adolescent sort of pinch points, things like sexual encounters, for example, and how a good deal of texts from the last 20 years have actually attempted to show sexual activity and encounters as something quite normal, mundane, everyday, rather than this reaching towards an epiphanic moment where everything changes. And this is quite a departure from work I've done before, where I was looking at those supernatural texts or novels where teenagers have magical powers, which is often combined with sexual kind of enlightenment and first encounters and first sexual experiences as a kind of transition that changes everything. So that's what I've noticed previously when I was looking at earlier YA novels. And the books I've been looking at more recently, I think, do focus much more on the sort of repeated sexual activity that is just part of life, that is normal and that is not necessarily going to transform that character into something they weren't already. And I think that's really fascinating and quite a departure and maybe quite a healthy move for YA novels to make in terms of their readership, not stressing sex in quite the same way as they have in the past. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that because I think it's going to be fun, writing that chapter.
Well, we hope to get you back on here to tell us more about that. And yeah, I second what you say about that sounds like a really exciting, interesting shift away from sex as a kind of sensational kind of founding moment in someone's life, and instead thinking about it as a more normal thing. I think if anything needs to be thought of as more normal, sex is definitely got to be. And I loved your suggestion that the normal and the ordinary are different things. I might come back to that later if I may.
Sure.
But do you want to tell us about the new journal?
Yeah, so this is really exciting. We are launching a new journal out of Fincham Press, which is the press of Roehampton University, supported by the English and Creative Writing Department. And the journal is called the International Journal of Young Adult Literature. And we're launching that this October, and we have a full first issue featuring established but also emerging scholars of YA. I really wanted this project to come off because although there's lots of people working in YA studies, lots of work being done, it feels like there's a gap in the academic market, if you like. And YA has so often traditionally been tied or yoked to children's literature, which isn't always a problem, but it seems like quite often YA just gets given an extra chapter at the end of a book on children's literature, or it's children's literature and YA, but we won't really worry so much about the YA. So I felt like there really needed to be a dedicated space, and I was delighted when lots of people agreed with me and agreed to be on the editorial board. So we've got a stellar collection of people working across the world on YA who agreed to help with this project. And the first issue has also come out of a symposium that we ran at Roehampton last spring, so spring 2019, which our PhD student, Emily Corbett, led on and organised brilliantly. And that symposium was called Being Human in YA Literatures. And that was a real sort of spur to get some of the material and the work from that symposium published in a forum that was specialised. So we will be featuring some of the papers from that symposium, some new work, some commissioned work. There's also a very exciting roundtable discussion where Emily and a colleague of ours, Leah Phillips, had managed to get together our editorial board and the editorial board of a new association called the Young Adult Studies Association in a Zoom meeting. In fact, 2 Zoom meetings because of the time difference in various people's schedules, to talk about what young adult fiction is about, what young adult scholarship is and what's it going to do next, and also to reflect on what's going on right now and how, you know, YA scholarship can respond to lockdown and the pandemic and the challenges of the global future, really. So that's a really exciting discussion, and I'm hoping the readers will kind of jump on that and open up discussions in the future.
Yeah, again, we'll make sure to have a link below this video for anyone who wants to follow along. But congratulations on that. It's really exciting. And I love the way it's both creating a new space for the field, but also offering a kind of state of play of the fields and responding in such a live way to our current, very unusual, bizarre working conditions. I think all of those things will be really exciting. Before I end with the final question, Alison, which will be about literature and where that word sits for you. Yeah, do you mind telling us, just because you tantalizingly talked about the difference between normal and ordinary, could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. So again, using conventions around YA as my starting point, the idea of normality crops up a lot. It is a sort of obsession for many young adult protagonists, a desire to both be normal, be like others, and to somehow be extraordinary and to be, you know, different from others. And it's a kind of tension that is observed amongst sociologists and psychologists of adolescence, a desire to fit in and to stand out, and that sort of, you know, tussling between those two being part of the work of adolescence. But the idea of being normal works around the idea of norms, something that can be measured against other people. So you might be a normal height, or you might be a normal intelligence, you might have a normal body or a normal mind. And these are features of your own identity that can only be judged according to this association with others. So it's a kind of constraint as well as a way of thinking about your own identity. And in some critical perspectives, it's actually considered to be a kind of pathology to worry about yourself in relation to others. So I was looking at the work of Erich Fromm, who talks about the idea of normalcy or normality as being a pathology. As soon as individuals start to worry about whether they're normal or not, they're asking the wrong questions. They're looking at themselves from the wrong angle. And instead, what they should be asking is, who am I and what makes me me? Not how do I relate to others? And I think a lot of work on YA has focused on the normal, because that is such a common kind of concern around adolescence. Ordinariness doesn't necessarily involve that comparative element. So ordinariness, for me at least, and for certainly a number of cultural studies critics, is about the kind of connective tissue of the everyday world that is the backdrop to our lives. So it doesn't necessarily relate to our own identity. It's much more the sort of hidden stuff of every day. And it is for that reason I find it fascinating, because it's so often the unobserved, the stuff that doesn't seem important, the stuff that is overlooked and doesn't feel necessary. It's, you know, going back to Barthes, it's not the action of the narrative, it's the nodes that join things together, and for that reason, as I say, often overlooked. So those are the differences in my mind. I don't know if that was completely clear. It's something I'm still working on theorising, but I think it's a useful distinction to make.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And thank you for the various nodes of connecting things together that you've given us across the film. We've taken lots of steps, we've gone to lots of different places. So we finished the films, Alison, by asking what the word literature means to you, and you're welcome to answer this in as personal or professional a way as you like. You've just launched the International Journal of Young Adult Literature, so yeah, I'm always really interested to hear where that word sits for people, what it means to them, how it works for them.
Yeah, it's good that you pointed out the journal's title, actually, because I thought long and hard about the title, and it could easily have been the International Journal of YA Studies, or YA Narratives, perhaps. I was quite keen on literature, and I'm hoping it's not for a stuffy, sort of old-fashioned reason, but I did have this feeling that YA needed kind of grounding in a tradition. And again, I'm maybe generalizing a little bit, but it feels like a lot of approaches to young adult fiction or young adult literature focus very much on the contemporary moment, on future developments, on the sort of nimbleness of the form as something that is constantly refreshing itself because of its very nature. Thinking about the audience as young adults, generation through generation. And that is an exciting part of the study of YA. But I think what it often misses is the fact that this isn't just a contemporary moment, that there have been books for young people for decades, if not centuries, depending on how you define it. And I'm really keen to stress that tradition, because I think that can get lost, and some of the richness of understanding entertainment forms for young people can get lost with it if we're not careful. So I stuck with literature because that, to me, allows YA to enter into the realm of literary studies more generally, to think about books for young people as having this literary tradition, and perhaps also connecting it with other forms of literature. What connection does YA have with adult fiction that's of the same period, or children's books that came out in the same decade? And I think there's really interesting work still to be done in those areas. And the other word, and this isn't quite answering your question, but the other word in the journal's title that's really important is international. And I should point out that the first issue is just one step in that direction, and maybe it won't have gone as far as it will do in the future. But the international opportunities for learning more about young adult literature across the world are really exciting to me, and something I want to open up for dialogue. And I've said already that sometimes there's a focus very much on American YA. I'm focusing on British YA, but I am so excited to hear other national traditions and learn a bit more about sort of current work that's being done around the globe. So that's an important element of literatures for me, is the international literatures that are out there.
Yeah, great, thank you. I mean, we asked that question partly to unpack some of the baggage around the word literature, and quite a lot of that baggage is around thinking of it as a European art form, probably a Western European art form. So it's always good to be pushed to thinking way beyond those traditional remits. Alison, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much. I'm thinking about disappointment and shame, but in a good way. Feminist work, decrying the younger self. I think it's really interesting that both scholarly discourses and the discourses of people, real people that you spoke to, re-encountering books, produce that relationship with the younger self. And I'm excited at the way that your book, has challenged that as well, and thought about more positive or more creative ways of relating to that work. I can't wait to hear more about ordinariness and normality, and I'm looking forward to hopefully getting you back on here again if you'd be willing to hear more about that as the project progresses. And finally, good luck with the launch of the International Journal for Young Adult Literature.
Thanks, Andy. It's been a pleasure. I think we should both go and have a cup of tea now.
I can actually, the soundtrack to this conversation in the last 2 minutes, which I hope you can't hear, is the kettle going on. So I'm absolutely off to do that. Take care.
So much. Cheers.